Thank you very much. Delighted to be here at Starmus, and again, thank you, Garrick, for the invitation. I've been asked to talk a bit about the very basic science considerations that we need to give just for human survival in space. So, astronauts, you all have my permission to go to sleep for the next few minutes. But what I would also like to do, actually, is to touch on one of those, I think, very human aspects that we've heard a lot in many of the science presentations over the last few days. And that's about using our opportunities. How many times have we heard people who've said, well, actually, it was because of a chance meeting or a particular circumstance. It wasn't just that it happened to them, but actually they were open to something at that time. Now, you know, it's very important, of course, to focus on a goal. Goals are really good for us. They allow us to carry on further down a path and not get distracted from side to side by events that might just want to take us off in a different direction. But sometimes, if we're open to these different circumstances that come at us from left field sometimes, when we're least expecting them, it allows us, instead of just thinking linearly to the future, we can sometimes think laterally. We join the dots. We work in an interdisciplinary manner, and that can sometimes mean it gives us the opportunity to make a much bigger difference than we might ever have done before. And of course, going into space was, I suppose, my opportunity. I mean, I never expected to be an astronaut. I mean, I grew up in the 1960s. So yes, I'd heard of Apollo, of course I had. In fact, in Britain, we had to do school projects. In fact, it seemed that that year, in the sort of 1969, 1970, those years were the times when everything at school was related to something to do with going to the moon. So I knew that these big things were possible. But people in Britain didn't do things like that. You know, those people going to the moon, they were Americans. They were, to my mind, they were military or pilots, or both. They were usually men, but definitely not British. They were definitely not anybody like me. So I grew up in a small town, a large city actually, but small town relative to a lot of places elsewhere in the world, at Sheffield, in the north of England. I went to the school down the road. I lived in a very normal family. Everybody had very normal expectations around us, and nobody ever expected that, you know, we had careers lessons at school. Never did a careers teacher suggest that one day you should consider going into space. So instead, I did things that were just more normal stuff. Now, unlike some of the brilliant scientists we've heard from today, I'm not an absolutely brilliant scientist. I never grew up with science as being my one and only thing in life. Actually, I found it really difficult at school, because I didn't know what I wanted to do. I was equally good at sciences, at languages. I loved languages, actually, and learning to speak different languages and understanding the linguistics aspect of that. And I also loved music. I kind of fancied the idea of being a professional pianist at one stage, and then my fingers never grew quite long enough, so that had disappeared. But I really struggled to really want to know what was it, what was my goal, what did I want to do with my life. So I actually, in the end, made a very pragmatic, very boring decision that I knew that once I'd left school, after full-time education, it was going to be very difficult to pick up on scientific concepts. Whereas I could go to another country and learn a language, I could go to a music teacher and learn how to play an instrument. But actually, learning science was going to be easier if I did that in full-time education. So I was going to study science. Which science? Didn't really know, didn't really matter at that stage. I chose chemistry, just because, well, it was one of those sciences that I thought was a kind of a middling kind of subject. I could go physical, I could go biological. I didn't know still. But of course, the more I studied chemistry, the more I really grew to love it. How can you not love anything? The more that we find out about it, the more questions there are. And I just love the idea of being able to use that, actually. Use it in industry. My first job was in the electronics industry. I was making display screen equipment, and I was sort of catapulted really into a company where everybody else were physicists and electronic engineers, and I was the only chemist. So I had all of this responsibility for all the materials, all the clean water, and all the clean air and everything. But what a fabulous opportunity for somebody straight out of university. But after a while, I knew I needed to do something a bit different, and well, that was when I got my job at Mars Confectionery. Now, I didn't actually work on Mars bars when I started. I was in the, I was a research technologist there. My job was actually, as part of the research and development team, to make the first ice cream Mars bar, which is still just a figment of the marketing team's imagination at that stage. So yeah, a fabulous thing to be able to do, and I ended up in the chocolate department at Mars. Can you imagine, a job where you're using your science, something that you love, as part of a team, a collaborative team of people, to make something that people love in the world, and I could taste chocolate every day if I wanted to. It was a fabulous job, and I still had not considered anything else at that stage. I was still quite naive. What is there to do in the world? It seemed to be such a big place, and yet working at Mars was what I was enjoying doing. Of course, it became a newspaper editor's dream, didn't it? I mean, all the headlines, when they found out that somebody working for the Mars confectionery company had applied to go into space, there were headlines like, "Girl from Mars goes to the stars," hence my title. There were things like, they made jokes on the Milky Way and on the galaxy, all these chocolate bars. But I really was, as you heard, just driving my car home from work one evening when an opportunity came to me completely out of the blue. I hadn't thought about doing anything else at that stage, whereas instead of music on my car radio, as I tuned into the next station, I caught an advert that said astronaut wanted. Now, I applied, never ever imagining that I would get chosen. In fact, I almost didn't apply because I assumed I would not get selected. And so that's one of my biggest messages for so many people here in the audience, is that sometimes you just have to have a go and don't be scared of the possibility that you might fail. I arrived in Star City to be greeted by a very, very new environment. I wasn't used to military life. This was a military base. I wasn't used to speaking the Russian language, although found it fascinating. That was one of the things we had to learn, of course, as part of the training. But the training did go on, for 18 months. And finally, at the end of that 18 months, when all of the training was done, this was me and my crew, so to be in the centre of the photograph at the time, but the commander's normally in the middle. In this case, the commander, Anatoly Artsebarsky, and we see there on the right of the picture. And on the other side, we have Sergei Kriklyov, who actually ended up being the last Soviet citizen. So this is way back, they're talking about 1991 I flew into space. And I flew as part of still a very communist Soviet Union to the Mir space station. And Sergei ended up spending 10 months in space, and when he came back to Earth, Russia had become a separate country, and so that's hence it became known as this last Soviet citizen. So this is just really set you the context. So we went to the Mir space station, a kind of precursor in many respects to the International Space Station that we'll hear later on this afternoon much more about from Gennady Padalka. In fact, I did my training with Gennady. He was one of the beginning of his training at the time. So yeah, I very much remember the times that we had together in our training dinner. But yeah, Mir Space Station, fabulous place, modular design, so very much like the ISS. And just a very quick view of my crew when I actually arrived there. Tolya's taken the photograph. So behind me is Sergei, and on my right I've got Musa Manarov, the engineer there, and on my left there we have Viktor Afanasyev, who was the commander. And this was then our crew on board the space station with Tolya, and we just had to get on with life in space. But of course, the first thing that we really start to enjoy feeling is that feeling of weightlessness. Tolya and I here just messing around for the camera. Actually, this picture was taken in one of the 2 days it took us to get to the space station on board Soyuz. But what I wanted to do really to talk about this photograph here is just look at my face and how fat and puffy my face looks. And the first things that we feel is this body fluid that tends to rise through our chest or towards our upper chests and our head, because our hearts are still pumping to keep enough blood in our brains to stop us from fainting when we stand up. But of course, in space, feeling weightless, no longer is there a force pulling blood away from our heads. And so we don't need to have all of this, if you like, this extra movement upwards towards our heads. And you end up feeling very congested. It doesn't last so very long, a couple of days or so, before our brains work out there's too much fluid in every cell in our head, and tell our kidneys to excrete about 2 litres of urine, more than we would normally excrete on Earth. But of course in that urine we've lost not just water, but a whole load of minerals from the body. It's one of the reasons why we tend to lose calcium from our bones, and so our diets have to be maintained in order to do that, to keep that calcium up. We're spending a long time in space. my mission was 8 days. But if we're going to be spending months in space, as many people do nowadays, we need to not only keep our bone density high with exercise as well as with nutrition, but also there's things like potassium is lost from muscles. Our whole body chemistry changes. And as a chemist, I love that concept that we just have a hydrostatic pressure difference that is no longer. So basically physics is affecting our chemistry, which then ultimately affects our biology. And so, we heard from about this interconnectedness around the world, but of course we have this interconnectedness of all science as well. The other thing that we have to get used to, of course, in an orbiting space station, it's not just inside our bodies that feel weightless, but of course the air is apparently weightless. Now, normally not a big deal, we're all sort of sitting here quite still, breathing out, because you breathe out this nice warm air with a bit more carbon dioxide in it, and, well, it rises, because warm air rises because a certain volume of warm air weighs less than the same volume of cold air on Earth. Of course, in an orbiting space station, warm air doesn't rise. You don't get those convection currents. So if you do nothing about it, the air doesn't circulate. You end up, ultimately, you could actually, if you stayed still enough, you could build up such a big bubble of carbon dioxide around you that you could, I suppose, suffocate in your own breath. But of course, we know about this. And so it's very easy. We have fans. We need to circulate the air around the space station. And so fans just keep that air moving around. Fans are quite noisy. You know what it's like when you turn your computer off at the end of the day and it all goes nice and quiet. Well, of course, the fans can't turn off. You don't want them to go off in space. You want them to maintain on. We had 69 decibels on board near space station. So one of the things that we had to do was monitor each other's hearing. And I know that is certainly a factor when astronauts used to return from the Mir space station. Their ears, their hearing levels were reduced. Short term particularly, but also to some extent in the long term as well. International Space Station, again I might mention it later, but it is much better than 69 decibels. Different parts of it have different noise levels, and I do understand, Tim Peake told me that it was the Japanese module, which is the most quiet and peaceful. I think it's rather nice, isn't it? But of course it's that lack of convection that's also really good. We want to do some experiments. And so just very briefly, I thought I'd mention just one of those experiments that certainly for a chemist to be able to grow crystals in space was just an absolute joy. Now, of course, we can grow some beautiful crystals on Earth, but crystals of protein are quite tricky to grow on Earth. And the problem is that when we start to crystallize, take the protein out of solution, we get some very, very local, very, very small, but significant enough convection currents set up in that solution. These long, floppy molecules start floating around. They don't have great big bonds, very strong bonds between the molecules of protein, unlike ionic bonds and things like in salts. So the protein molecules slip around each other, and when they do create crystals, they're not very big, and also they tend to have many more dislocations between the molecules, and so really they're not formed in as nice a way as they could be for us to get us good enough information about that protein. You can grow protein crystals in space without this convection currents messing up proteins. You can create huge crystals, beautifully formed inside, without all of these rotten dislocations and so on between the molecules. Bring those crystals back to Earth, zap them with X-rays, look at the diffraction pattern, and you can actually then understand so much more about those molecules, what they actually are, and how they interact with other proteins in the body. And it's that kind of science that really does impact everything and so much of what we do on Earth. So I'm going to move on a little bit because I did mention a bit about nutrition, and this is a picture taken of a basil plant from the International Space Station. It's grown up there. Astronauts now are quite happily eating a little bit of some of the salads that they're able to grow. And it's this very sort of strongly tasting leaves, I suppose, we call them salad leaves. They're quite good for astronauts because the sense of taste diminishes a little bit in space. And, if you want to keep people in space for a long time, you want to give them a bit of an appetite, they need to keep eating and eating the right kind of stuff. I love the little balls of water that you can see. This basil plant has been watered recently, sprayed, and some little balls of water just collected on the end of those leaves there. But just sort of carrying on from sort of a bit of this nutrition that we spoke about in terms of keeping the body strong, we needed, obviously, to take our food with us. Apart from a tiny bit of food that is grown in space, we don't grow fruit in space. We still haven't managed to grow proper, decent fruiting plants like that. And so it's still quite a big deal. I was doing experiments on growing fruit and veg in space 30 odd years ago almost, and yet we still haven't got a good way of keeping ourselves alive with food, being able to survive for a long time. We still take up tins of stuff, dried packets of stuff. I'm sure they taste much nicer now. And I'm told the International Space Station is rather a luxury environment compared to what I was used to on the Mir Space Station. I think it's been compared to a 4-star hotel, ISS, whereas the Mir Space Station is a bit like going on a family camping trip, like staying in a tent. Of course, we took with us loads of water because we need to drink, but we do recycle. I think Nicole mentioned a bit about the sort of stuff inside the space station, recycling. We breathe out a load of water in our breath. And so we're able to pass that water, because you're circulating the air, so it's quite useful. So you can circulate the air over panels, cold panels, and collect the water, condense that water that you can then clean and reuse. Water, of course, also collected from urine in the toilet. So the number of different processes, including osmosis, as well as just basic filtration, some heating techniques, and chemical cleaning as well, that we can actually use to clean the water, clean the urine into water that you can drink, or actually then electrolyze. So by passing electric current through that water, we separate out the hydrogen and the oxygen. At the moment, the hydrogen mostly is wasted. The oxygen, though, is used to replenish the air on board the space station. And we had a number of different ways of creating that oxygen. Of course, if you've got something that's absolutely vital to human life, you really need to make sure that you're keeping that oxygen concentrations up. If your electrolysis system breaks down, for instance, then we have chemical ways using lithium chlorate. Lithium chlorate contains a lot of oxygen that we can use by heating it to then expel the oxygen and just top up the oxygen levels on board the space station. We also need, of course, to get rid of this carbon dioxide that you've heard about a number of times over the last few days. We use that by collect that on filters of lithium hydroxide. That absorbs the CO2 nicely. Sweat. We all sweat, and one of the breakdown products of sweat is ammonia. We need to be able to filter out the ammonia from the air. The Earth does so much for us that we just don't think about. So actually breaking down, so ammonia we can filter out on charcoal filters, methane, I don't need to tell you where methane comes from, and a whole load of other things that outgas, of course, up on board the space station, that we need to filter out. Our clothes are specially designed not to create much dust, but it's human skin that creates most of the dust up there that is just physically filtered out of the air. And I sneezed so much in space. I'm not sure now looking back, and some people say, well, that was maybe because my immune system had been affected somehow by feeling weightless, and that is possibly a problem on longer term space flight. But for me, I think it was just the amount of dust there. And of course, heat. Our bodies just produce so much of this heat. We have to have ways of getting rid of that heat. And so what we do is we have a number of heat exchange systems. We can pass the heat from the air to some water in pipes, which we then exchange into liquid ammonia on the outside of the space station that runs through pipes into radiators, and then we can radiate that heat off out into space. So we are still a very long way from a nice closed-loop system. So something that engineers are really, I know, working very hard on. We're getting much better at it, but we've still got, I think, a long way to go before we do actually enable people to have these closed-loop systems and habitats a very long way away from Earth without taking up with us all of our refreshments of food, water, more oxygen possibly, and everything else that we need up there. At the end of the day, we all get tired, and so this is my little bedroom area. I hope you don't mind the mess in my bedroom here. I shared it with some binoculars and a load of science equipment, and of course my sleeping bag, sort of see on the right, just sort of attached to the wall there. But the reason I'm showing you this picture really is that black circle in the middle, because that was my bedroom window. And just before I arrived on the space station, a small mark arrived on that window, about 4 millimeters in diameter, and it looked just like this one. Now this one we know was made on a shuttle orbiter window, and it was made by a fleck of paint travelling at orbital velocity. Of course, these huge velocities that we have, we've mentioned before today, 5 miles per second, 8 kilometers per second. So these huge velocities, kinetic energy, of course, half mv squared, it's related to the square of your velocity. So if you have such a huge orbital velocity like that, a fleck of paint with such a small mass can still have such a huge energy to create marks in space station windows. Of course, there are marks all over the outside of the ISS, and they were on the outside of Mir. And it is a serious problem, not just, of course, thinking about could they penetrate the space station, and potentially, I suppose, if there was something large enough it would have a big enough energy. But there are stations made with different layers. The windows are multi-paneled as well. But when people are going out to do spacewalks, this is a picture of my compatriot Tim Peake, who spoke a couple of days ago, doing his spacewalk, and we really have to be careful about that. And it's not just because the artificial stuff that's out there. It's a huge amount of objects, 10 centimetres and bigger. Now, the artificial stuff tends to be travelling in the same direction that we are, so its relative velocity to us is diminished a little bit. But nonetheless, there's a load of stuff that isn't. Natural things out there as well, of course, meteoroids, and we really have to be careful about that. And so EVA is especially scheduled, but the engineering, the technology to shield us from that really harsh space environment is one of the reasons it still makes being in space something that really is something not to be taken lightly. Now, you've seen this picture before today, International Space Station, which of course where the current crew is, 3 of them up there at this moment, are still, although in low Earth orbit. The Moon so many years ago, we haven't forgotten about it though, and we know that we want to work to go further, and a lot of what's happening on ISS now, again, will tell us about it later, I'm sure, is about going further on, ultimately to Mars, which is going to be absolutely fabulous. But we know there's still a couple of really big challenges before we send astronauts to Mars. And I think, certainly from the human aspect, that biggest thing is radiation damage. The Earth's magnetic field usually protects us beautifully from all that cosmic radiation. But upon Mars, there isn't that magnetic protection, and the damage that astronauts will receive by the cosmic radiation will basically give people cancer. It could make people blind because of the cataracts. And so, of course, there's all of this shielding that has to happen, and we can be alert for things like solar flares, which will produce more radiation. We monitor, but that's a bit late by the time you've had your radiation damage. And so really now we're thinking the first few astronauts on Mars will take pharmaceuticals. It will be drugs that actually help to keep people alive. And actually those drugs, of course, are being worked on in conjunction with a lot of cancer therapy on Earth. So these synergies are used very, very well, I think. But the other big problem in space still is growing fruit, growing enough of our own food and nutritional food that we're going to need to actually survive a long time off this planet. So still an awful lot of work to do. But I think everybody's in agreement that we really are very excited about very soon going further and further away from Earth than we have ever been. Now, I have one last picture to show you, and this is really my homage to Apollo. It's of course taken by Apollo 17 on their way to the Moon. But this is something, an image that I think reminds me very much that wherever we are, whatever we're doing about space, space is a fabulous place to look outwards so that we can understand the universe, as we've heard so much about this week, and that's great. Space is also a fabulous place to use as a frontier, to push forward that human boundary so that we can actually keep going and keep going. Arthur C. Clarke said that once an organism ceases to explore, it starts to die. And I think it's just in our nature to keep on pushing out. But of course, space is a fabulous place to look back on our home planet. And of course, we know that a lot of the work that we do in space is about, it impacts Earth, whether we're talking about the climate change or making drugs based on protein crystals that have been grown in space, or the microelectronics that we use that are actually being developed but on systems that were actually used in spacecraft technology. So all of that impacts our life very much on Earth. But it's actually generally that looking back that every astronaut just loves to do. At the end of the day, all of us on board the Mir space station would find the biggest window we could, just gather around it and look out at the Earth. And I could never make out whether I thought the Earth was really very small or actually much larger. And I know from the Moon, of course, it would look this teeny kind of thing. But also, when we were orbiting the Earth, we'd go all the way around in 92 minutes, and that does make it feel pretty small. But when I really thought about where we were moving, To go for the part of the world that I'm most familiar with, Western Europe, that took 5 minutes. It was gone. Africa, you can see here, Africa takes 20 minutes. You manage to go sort of northish to southish. The Pacific Ocean, 40 minutes. Now that made me realise how many opportunities there are if we remain open enough to see them for everyone to make a difference. From Mars to the stars and back home. Thank you.